Hi everybody, welcome to the Top 2 Inches of Sport podcast with me, Anthony Sheriff. This is a podcast about something that's always fascinated me, the mindset required to succeed in elite level sport. On this podcast, I'm going to talk to people who I really look up to in the world of sport and try to find out how they deal with the highs and lows that come with consistently striving for success in the unforgiving environment of elite sport. For this week's episode, I spoke to former US Marine Rob Jones. Rob lost both of his legs in battle in 2010 while serving in Afghanistan, but he hasn't let that deter him from completing some incredible physical challenges since then. He's a 2012 Paralympian where he won a bronze medal for his country in a rowing event just 2 years after being wounded in battle. He's also completed some brutally challenging endurance events, including cycling 5,200 miles across America and also completing a month of marathons, which saw Rob complete 31 marathons in 31 days. In this episode, Rob tells his whole story from US Marine to Paralympian to extreme endurance athlete. So here's this week's episode of the Top 2 Inches of Sport with Rob Jones. We're recording. Right, Rob, this is episode 16, I think, of this podcast now. So I've been lucky enough to speak to 15 people involved in high-level sport, and they've all had really interesting stories from a mentality point of view. Well, since I've read up on your story, I don't think I've ever met anyone that's shown such perseverance and determination and just mental strength that you've shown. So I'm looking forward to speaking to you. Massive thanks for coming onto the podcast.
Oh, I appreciate the compliments. Thanks for having me, and really a real pleasure to be talking to you. This is my first international podcast.
Same here, actually. First American person I've had on, so same here. So look, we'll talk about the sports side of things later as we go on. But again, just reading up on your story, I think these kind of sporting achievements you've had are probably built on the different mental steps you've built in which from your time in the Marines. So I just want to talk to you about your time in the Marines first. So you actually joined when you were 20. I think you were actually studying in college as well. So the very fact that you were studying in college makes it seem like you were kind of going down a different road. But what was it that drew you to the Marines?
Yeah, so I was originally going down the computer science road in college. Honestly, I wasn't a very good student. I kind of just tried to rest on the success that I had in high school, using that same kind of mentality that I had, where I would kind of do my homework in the morning and not really study for much. I did well. I had a good GPA and everything, but that just didn't work in college. And yeah, so I just wasn't a very good student, and I ended up not doing well in computer science. And instead of changing my approach, I just kind of started to feel bad about myself and feel isolated and lonely. And, I just kind of felt like there was things that were missing from my life, pieces that were missing, and I didn't know what they were. And so I just so happened to get an instant message on AOL Instant Messenger from a friend of mine a couple days or a few days after I got a bad grade on a test that kind of told me that I wasn't going to be able to graduate in 4 years like I had planned. And he told me about how he joined the Marine Corps and how he felt so good about himself now and all these things. That kind of made me curious. So I started researching the Marine Corps, and I ended up reading this book called Brotherhood of Heroes, which is about the Battle of Peleliu during World War II. And yeah, that book just really struck a chord with me. And it showed me that the pieces of my life that I was missing were things like courage, brotherhood, selflessness, traits like that. And so I figured the best way for me to achieve those traits was join the Marine Corps. So I think maybe the day or the day after I finished the book, I went down to the recruiter's office and I signed up pretty much right away.
What did your family think then when you were veering away from the computer science and you were going to the Marines?
I think they kind of knew that I wasn't really enjoying myself. I think the joining the Marine Corps, I didn't tell anybody. I didn't consult with them or anything before I joined. And so when I called them and said, I joined the Marine Corps, I think they were very surprised. Like, my dad's response was, "Why?" And then my mom, obviously, she, this was 2006, so we were in the middle of a war, so she was very scared.
Yeah.
For me. But I think, ultimately, after I told them my reasoning, they were proud, but still, obviously scared, rightfully so.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. What was the actual training like in the Marine Corps then? Because like you would imagine anyway, just from the outside looking in, it's quite brutal. So physically and mentally, how did you find the training?
Yeah, the boot camp is kind of a unique training atmosphere in the Marine Corps. I mean, I know that the most people commonly think that boot camp is how all Marine Corps training is done, and so it's kind of the Marine Corps. The boot camp mentality is different from the training in the rest of the Marine Corps. But in terms of boot camp, yeah, it's about being kind of broken down to a piece of clay and then molded into what a Marine needs to be. And so, yeah, I kind of prepared myself with my recruiter and everything. They take time to, if you have it, they take time to kind of get you ready. And I read a couple books about what boot camp was like. And so I was kind of prepared for it. I was prepared that they were going to scream at me no matter what. But basically, it's about teaching you to be a part of a brotherhood or a camaraderie, and at the same time teaching you to never settle for the way that you are now. Always try and improve and improve and improve. And so the way that they do that is by making sure that nothing you ever do is good enough. So if your bed is made exactly to their specifications, they'll find that 1 millimeter that you're off on your fold on your sheet or something, or they'll find that one wrinkle that shouldn't be there, or they'll find that one speck of dust on the thing that on your rifle that should have been cleaned off, and they'll punish you for it. And that's the second way. They don't not only do they punish you, but they punish everybody in the whole platoon for your mistakes. And so they put everybody under this microscope, and they collectively punish you so that you feel a responsibility for everybody else in the platoon, and you use that responsibility to want to do what's good for the whole platoon as a way to force yourself to strive to be better and be disciplined. And so, you basically just spend the whole time running back and forth and getting screamed at and doing push-ups and sit-ups and squats and all these different things, while you kind of learn the customs and courtesy of being a Marine, the lore, the history of being a Marine, and then learning the basic skills like how to shoot a rifle and how to march and how to fight a little bit during that time.
Did that process mentally break many people that were in your platoon? Like, did you yourself at any stage ever think, "Oh, this isn't for me"?
No, I mean, I think there's plenty of people that do end up deciding that the Marine Corps isn't for them. Now, whether or not they can then leave the Marine Corps is another story. I think a lot of the time, I think the Marine Corps holds on to you and they want to make you into Marine regardless. But for me, it was what I wanted. I knew that was what I wanted, and this is what I had to do to get what I wanted. Yeah. And so I was prepared for it. And somebody that hadn't prepared for it and wasn't sure that maybe they were joining the Marine Corps for a different reason, like they wanted money for college or they wanted to prove something to themselves. I don't know, whatever the case may be. It's possible that could certainly affect people in a different way and maybe even affect them negatively. But for me, I knew it's exactly what I wanted to do. So the boot camp was really a breeze.
Yeah. So you went to Iraq then in 2008. Would you say that process of boot camp, did that prepare you very well for Iraq, or was that still a very stressful experience when you first experienced it?
Boot camp, I mean, it lays the foundation. It doesn't really necessarily prepare you to go to war. It kind of lays the foundation for you to be prepared. So it kind of gives you the rudimentary basics of how to fight. It gives you a little bit of stress load, so it kind of teaches you a little bit about how to handle stress. It teaches you about the camaraderie and how to be a part of a brotherhood or a sisterhood or whatever it may be. But you don't master those things, or really get good at them until you do some training, some more specific training on how to go to war, and then it's war itself that really makes you, quote unquote, a master of all these qualities.
Yeah.
And usually it's not even going to war; it's being in combat. And so I didn't experience combat in Iraq in 2008 because the word kind of died down. But I did get to a point where I felt like I had become the person that I wanted to be when I read that book, Brotherhood of Heroes. The experiences there were difficult enough, and we relied on I relied on my fellow Marines enough that I felt like I was now a part of a brotherhood, and I had exemplified courage and selflessness in other ways besides getting shot at and shooting back.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I wasn't totally satisfied with deployment because I did join the Marine Corps to go into combat because I knew combat was the avenue to become a master of these qualities that I was searching for.
Okay. Now you were a combat engineer, yeah? So like, what was your day to day when you were in Iraq first?
Yeah, Iraq. So for me in Iraq, my day to day was going around finding buried weapons caches. So we would get a tip from a local Iraqi that there are some old mortars or machine guns or whatever buried somewhere in town, and so we would patrol out with an infantry unit to the area. They'd set up security, and then I'd just go over the area with a metal detector trying to find it. And then once we found it, we'd dig it up and dig whatever it was up and set it off to the side, and explosive ordnance disposal would come in and grab it. Now, earlier in Iraq, when the war was a little bit more hectic, combat engineers would be used for explosive breaching and then also IED detection.
Okay. So, and then when you went to Afghanistan in 2010, was your duty pretty similar, or were you actually encountering far more combat at that stage?
Yeah, so Afghanistan, there was more combat. So I was in a place called Sangha in Afghanistan, which had been in British hands for a long time. And then they passed it over to us for us to clear out Taliban fighters. So at that point, that's when we didn't do a whole lot of explosive breaching because they didn't really have that many buildings that had doors that we couldn't get into. But the IED detection and route clearance component of it came into it heavily. So basically, anytime we came to an area where we felt like there was a good chance of there being an IED, I would be a combat engineer like me, would be sent out to clear a path through that area. So, for example, if we were going to go over a bridge, we would know that there's a high likelihood that the Taliban would be putting IEDs on either side of the bridge. So I would cross the bridge first and clear a path and mark it. And then when I got to the other side, the rest of the Marines would cross that bridge following exactly on that path that I had laid out.
And just for people listening that maybe aren't actually quite sure of what an IED is, could you explain what exactly an IED is?
Yeah, it's IED stands for improvised explosive device. So it's the easiest way to put it is it's just an explosive that's in the ground that it's just a device that explodes in a variety of ways, whether by you stepping on it or somebody using a cell phone to call it or setting a tripwire or something like that. So it's like a landmine basically, but it can be set off in a variety of different ways.
Would you have been detecting them quite regular? Like, would this have been a daily thing coming across them, or was it quite rare?
It'd be a daily thing where we would be going into an area and clearing it. But it wouldn't be a daily thing where we'd find anything.
Okay.
I don't really have a percentage of, or anything for you. I mean, I can tell you that I went out a bunch of times and the first IED I actually encountered was the one that I stepped on. So it's just kind of a crapshoot as to whether or not the area that you go into there's an IED there or not. Or there could be an IED and the path that you take just so happens to skirt around it.
Yeah.
So it's like there may be IEDs all through it, but you're walking just kind of randomly, you pick this path and, it's a very thin margin of where the IED, the pressure plate or whatever it may be, actually is through that area.
Yeah. So let's talk about that day then. It was the 22nd of July in 2010. So you come across this IED that unfortunately explodes and you end up losing both your legs from above the knee. So could you just talk to us about what you actually remember from that day, first of all?
Yeah. So the day we were just seizing Taliban territory. So basically just walking into the Taliban's area and waiting for them to shoot at us so that they would tell us where they were, and then we shoot back and go kill them or whatever. And then we had several objectives. Like we were going to this specific compound at this grid coordinate. We were going to seize that, clear it to make sure there weren't any IEDs in it, and then set it up as a base, and then kind of solidify ourselves there, do some security patrols, and then kind of repeat this process a couple more times until we got to a certain line that the division wanted us to get to.
Okay.
And so around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we were kind of just walking along, and our point man stepped on an IED that malfunctioned. So what we heard was just a pop, kind of like a firecracker almost going off underneath of his foot. And I immediately recognized that he stepped on an IED, but it didn't function correctly for whatever reason. Just the blasting cap exploded. And so, but now, because what they like to do is, the Taliban likes to do is put 2 and 3 all in the same area, because when one person steps on one, they know that the Marines or soldiers or whoever is going to come for them. And so if they put a couple more around, these guys are not really going to be focusing on IED detection at that point. They're trying to get to their friend. And so they know that it's likely that they're going to step on these other IEDs. So basically what we had found was kind of a mini minefield of IEDs, and it was now my job to get us through that area. And so I started plotting a path through the area. And instead of me finding the IED, I stepped on it. It found me, and I was unconscious for maybe 15 seconds or so, and then I woke up. And it's a scene. It's kind of a lot like a war movie where the person that gets hit is screaming their head off and they're bleeding all over the place. And their fellow Marines, my fellow Marines rushed over to me, put tourniquets on me, and the corpsman arrived shortly thereafter, gave me morphine. And at that point, I was figuring I was going to be in a wheelchair for the rest of my life, and I was going to have to be looked after by my mom. And so I was just asking everybody to just finish me off, finish the job and put a bullet through me. But of course, nobody would do that, obviously. Yeah. And so they put me on a stretcher and took me to a tank, and the tank met a helicopter and, flew me out of there.
This might sound like a really stupid question, but how actually painful was it? Or is it one of those situations where your just body is in so much shock? Were you almost a little bit numb?
It was, there was a lot of numbness. Most of my body was numb, but it wasn't really pain like if you cut your finger type of pain. It was more like when you fall asleep on your arm and your arm goes numb. It's like behind your head or whatever, and it cuts off the circulation, and you wake up because it's like really, it's hurting from the numbness in your arm, and you can't really move your arm because the circulation hasn't been there for a long time, so you don't have control over it. So it felt like that, except magnified 100, 150 times or something like that. So a really, really, really powerful version of that. Yeah. So it wasn't really pain as you would expect. And my body was interesting because it felt like my body had kind of disconnected from the subconscious and the conscious mind, and my body was just kind of reacting to the explosion or the feelings that it was feeling. And like my body, I could hear my body screaming, but I wasn't like saying inhale, exhale. It was kind of doing it on its own. So it was kind of just reacting instinctually.
From the time you're lying on the battlefield then to the time you get back to the US, what's the time frame there? Because I've heard in the past, do military people who get injured in Afghanistan, they go to Germany for a couple of weeks? Is that true? You
go through Germany. Usually, for me, it really depends on the injury. So if it's a really, really, really serious injury, it's basically just you stay in Germany for as long as it takes you to be stabilized enough to be transported. And so it didn't take me long. I was in Germany. I went Camp Leatherneck / Camp Bastion right away, then Bagram Air Force Base, and then to Germany. And that whole time took 3 days. And then I stayed in Germany like 12 hours, and then they put me on a flight to Bethesda. And I arrived at Bethesda maybe 2 days later. So Bethesda, Maryland. and so which is around DC. I have to remember that a lot of people, maybe a lot of your listeners aren't from America, so
Probably zero, yeah.
yeah. So Bethesda Naval Hospital is just a naval hospital that's near DC that all the Marines and Navy that are wounded will go to. And so that took another 2 days. But yeah, I mean, it's just as long as it takes you to get stabilized. They want to get you back to America where the most support is as soon as possible.
Yeah. What other injuries did you get?
I mean, nothing that was extremely serious. Just kind of shrapnel damage to my buttocks, and burns on my hands. Both my eardrums were completely perforated. And that's it for injuries. They also diverted my colon to a colostomy because of the injuries to my rear end were close enough to the sphincter that there was a risk of injury. Like if I was going to the bathroom, there was risk of infection. And so they just I didn't have internal injuries. They just kind of diverted that until all those wounds down there healed.
Yeah. Still pretty serious things going on there. It's just probably comparatively compared to what had happened to you, it probably didn't seem like such a big deal.
Compared to having your legs chopped off, all those things are pretty minor, but compared to every day-to-day life, they're all very serious.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Talk to me then about rehab. So physically and mentally, was rehab like a difficult time for you? And also, how long did it take until you were comfortably walking with your prosthetic legs?
It was certainly physically grueling because I lost all of my strength and all of my muscle mass, so it took a long time to regain that. And then also on top of that, you're using your body in ways that it had never been used before, not really even designed to be used in the way that you walk with prostheses. So yeah, it's physically grueling and physically taxing, and psychologically grueling as well. For me, it didn't take me too long to accept my situation and sort of recognize that all of my energy and all of my time should be directed at moving forward instead of kind of looking back in the past and trying to undo something that I couldn't undo and that had already happened. So I was able to pretty quickly direct all of my energy forward and put it into this physical therapy process. But there's a lot of the most difficult thing for me was just getting over the ego and fear that was associated with falling down, or like kind of this learning process that had to happen with legs. Like I didn't want to fall down in the middle of therapy and have everybody look at me and think that, feel sorry for me or something. So, and be embarrassed by that failure of falling down, even though everybody in the clinic fell down, all the time. Somebody did it every day, but it's still, when it's you, it hurts your ego to have that happen. So I had to really work to put that aside and recognize that that's just fear talking, and letting that fear kind of prevent me from taking the risks that I needed to take in order to learn what I needed to learn was only going to hold me back. And so that doesn't mean that it was easy to deal with that fear, but I recognized it early on. And so every time it happened, I could tell what was going on in my head, and I could move past it, develop the courage to move past it. And so that kind of developed over time. But over time, as I got stronger physically, I got better and better at, handling that fear that inevitably came up until at the end. But it took me about a year to get comfortable walking with no assistive devices, meaning no canes, no wheelchair, no walker or anything like that, everywhere I went. And then at that point, I started learning how to run and ride a bike, and kind of learning all these things that you don't really have to. A lot of people don't learn. You don't have to learn them. But I wanted to learn so that I could be as recovered as possible, as physically capable as possible by the time I retired. So I learned, running, rowing, riding a bike, all these different things that I wanted to be able to do. And so the whole process until I retired. It took about a year and a half, but I was walking comfortably everywhere I went after a year.
Yeah, and we'll get onto your sporting achievements in a moment. But early on, like when you're going through rehab, is your mindset shifting already to accomplishing these unbelievable sporting achievements? Like, for example, you obviously did the month of marathons where you ran 31 marathons in 31 days. You competed in the Paralympics in 2012, which was only 2 years after your accident. And you're saying like the first year of that is pretty much rehab. So it's crazy to think of. You cycled across America. At what stage are you actually zone in on these as goals that I'm actually going to achieve? Because it seems ridiculous really to think somebody going through what you're going through is setting these like what seem really unattainable goals.
I never really so the way that these kinds of things develop for me is that I find out about whatever the event is, or I think about it. So the Paralympics is a good example of this. So I actually came across the Paralympics within the first month after being wounded. I was still in my hospital bed, trying to think. I always enjoyed working out before my injury, in the gym and all that kind of thing. And so, and I had kind of become fascinated with full-time, Olympic level athletes, just because I really admired their dedication and discipline to the one sport or one activity. And so I became interested in that. And so I started kind of looking about, well, how am I going to be able to work out after, as a disabled person? Is it even possible? What can I do? And I think I just Googled like disabled sports or something like that. And I found out about the Paralympics, and I saw the Paralympics had this rowing in it. And I remember that rowing was on the rowing machine in the gym was really tough. It always gave me a really good workout. And so I said, well, maybe I can learn how to row or something, and that'll be a good way for me to do exercise now. And I was like, Paralympics are actually in 2012. Maybe that'd be interesting. And so I just kind of find out about the event, and then I kind of put it aside because, there's no way I could really think about that, all these other things that I had to do before I even ever got to a point where I'm going to the Paralympics. I was barely getting out of my bed at that point. And so I recognize it and I put it aside. And then later on, as I get a little bit more advanced, I start to think about it again, and I start saying, well, maybe that it actually is possible. And then as time goes on, I start eliminating all the reasons why I shouldn't do it until I get to a point where I make the decision that I'm going to do it. And it kind of worked the same way with the bike ride, in that I wanted to learn how to ride a bicycle and therapy, which nobody that went through Walter Reed Army Medical Center, which is the rehab hospital that I went to, also near DC. Nobody had ever done that before as a double above knee amputee. And so, I started learning, and in order to motivate myself, I started reading about these endurance athletes that do these really tough things like the Race Across America and ultra marathons and things like that. And I thought, it'd be pretty cool if I rode my bike across the country one day, just as an aside, but knowing that I was nowhere near even being able to do that. And then, when the time came after the Paralympics and after the 2013 rowing season, to decide what to do next, I kind of swung back around to it, because by that time I had the strength and I had the skill to be able to ride a bike. And so I just kind of eliminated all the reasons not to do it. And then the month of marathons was a little bit different. I never really thought about running a marathon, so to speak. I would, as a way to motivate people in the clinic, the therapists were always asking you, hey, we have slots to run the Army 10 miler or the Marine Corps 10K or the Navy 5 miler, and just, you want to do this triathlon? Why don't you do this triathlon? They kind of encourage you to do these running events. And so I ran the Marine Corps 10K, which is run in conjunction with the Marine Corps Marathon. So I was kind of exposed to the Marine Corps Marathon at that point by running these 10K. And so later on in 2016 or 2015, actually, I knew that event existed. So when I was kind of searching for something to push myself or something to harness onto, I I knew that existed, and I decided to do it. So I kind of have the ideas in my head, and then they come back around at the right time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. So we'll talk about those three sort of events individually as we go on. But I just want to go back to, again, when you're going through rehab and this mentality you've got about taking on these challenges, do you think that actually comes almost from your background as a Marine? Like me, myself, I'm a bit of a sucker for like a quote. I love a quote and a mantra. And actually probably my favorite mantra is a very famous Marine mantra where they say adapt and overcome. So like when you're in the Marines, you're pretty much living, I suppose, by those values. So do you think those values just become so deeply ingrained in your psyche almost that as bad of a situation as you're in, it's just that Marine mentality of I'm just going to adapt and overcome? So do you think the fact that you are a Marine, you've gone through the training, you've gone through the wars, do you think that really, really stood to you in that moment?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, so one of the things that I learned in the Marine Corps was just the ability to never be deterred from my mission. And so that's what adapt and overcome is about.
Yeah.
And even, I would say adapt and overcome is even about the word adapt kind of has two meanings. Like you figure out how you can change your plan to overcome the obstacle, but at the same time, it also means adapt in that you adapt and you become stronger and more capable because you had to figure out this new way to achieve this obstacle. So like if you're lifting a weight, you have to figure out how you're going to lift this weight over your head or whatever. So that's adapting what you're doing in order to achieve an objective. But at the same time, because you did that, your muscles get stronger. So they adapt to the adapt in a way. So yeah, I mean, that's certainly, and there's sayings throughout the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps is prolific in its sayings, but that is one of the best ones. And it's certainly that attitude of just never being deterred from your mission, no matter what. It was certainly taught to me in boot camp, and then honed in Iraq and Afghanistan and in training, to the point where when I got to this point where I kind of had this objective of living a meaningful life and leading an enjoyable life, and I was doing it by being in the Marine Corps and fighting terrorism. When I got wounded, that means by which I was undertaking that task by fighting terrorism kind of got taken away, but I still had that mission that I wanted to reach. Yeah. And so I had to adapt the way that I reached that mission. Yeah. Because I adapted the way that I reached the mission, I became this different person, became stronger in other ways.
Yeah. No, your mentality, it's unbelievable for someone who went through what you went through. Like when we watch the news and when you hear in the media about veterans coming back from war who were wounded and injured, they do tend to kind of go down a negative road, don't they? You hear about like alcoholism, you hear about the PTSD, but I'm sure there probably is far more percentage-wise positive cases like yourself. So do you actually talk to veterans coming back, or have you in the past decade? Have you spoken to Marines coming back wounded?
Oh yeah, all the time. I try and do. I mean, I will say to your point. I would posit that the vast majority of people that come back wounded do have positive stories, and that the stories that we hear about with the alcoholism or the PTSD or things of that nature, those are the very, very minority. I think one statistic that I read was that 7% of combat troops come back with, I'll call it PTSD because there's lack of a better term, but it's probably something else. I don't really think it's a disorder, but PTSD, and then 25% of non-combat troops come back with it. So like I said, the vast minority. But the story that we hear the most often is either the service member overseas is a hero because they're fighting evil and they're overcoming all these things in battle, or when they come home, they are now a basket case. And so we don't see, those are the only two stories that you really see in the news media and movies, books. Well, you don't see it in books, but news media, movies, TV shows. Like every time there's a veteran character they almost always, as a matter of course, have the 1,000-yard stare, and they're always talking about how they have PTSD. And that's all you really see. That's really the only story. And so I'm kind of skipping ahead, but that was part of the reason that I wanted to do the month of marathons, because I recognized that in the media. I saw that every single day, all the time. Like, this is the only story that we're hearing. But I knew for a fact that the other story does exist, and it exists a lot more often. So my way of combating that problem was by creating that story, or making sure that that story got told, by doing this incredibly difficult thing, like being a double above knee amputee, running all these marathons, doing this incredible thing that I knew that the media couldn't help but cover.
Yeah.
And so, to your point, yes, the positive story is the more common story. Then I kind of forgot the second part of your question.
I think I have as well, to be honest. But let's move on to sport anyway. So if we talk about the 2012 Paralympics, I looked at the dates. It was, I think it was like 2 years and a month, or 2 years and 2 months, but it was pretty much 2 years on the button since your accident when you actually competed in London 2012, which is just unbelievable when I hear you talking now about going through that rehab for the first year. And you mentioned there that you used to have a go of the rowing machine. Like, was that your only experience of rowing before actually training for the Paralympics?
Yeah, it was. It was the only experience I had. So really no experience whatsoever, because I'm sure I did it with very, very, very poor technique. But it was kind of a lucky situation where there was an adaptive rowing program close. Well, it was in DC. It took me an hour to get there, driving through the middle of the city, but it was close enough that I could go there after therapy and come back and kind of learn how to do it. And the coach that I just so happened to find that ran the program knew about the Paralympics, and knew another double above knee amputee female named Oksana that also wanted to go to the Paralympics. And so a lot of things fell into place. But yeah, I mean, that was my only experience with it. But I kind of picked it up pretty quickly, or quickly enough. And we didn't start training full time together until late December of 2011. So we really only had 8.5 months or so before we were on the world stage at the Paralympics.
How tough was the training for the Paralympics? If you were to compare that to like what you went through with the Marines, was it almost easy compared to what you were used to?
It was in some ways easier, but in other ways more difficult. Like, as an athlete, you are making sure that you get fed perfectly every day. You're making sure that you get tons of sleep every day. You're making sure that you're treating yourself like like your body is your temple, and making sure you're taking care of yourself. Whereas in the Marine Corps, you're kind of training to be able to perform in adverse, terrible conditions. So you're doing your training on no sleep or very little sleep, not fed, freezing cold, in the rain, all these different aspects. And so I would say Marine Corps training is more difficult in that. But that obviously prepares me for the times where the training during rowing was, like, if I had to go out and row in the rain, it really wasn't that big of a deal. Yeah. Unless there was lightning, we went out and we rowed in the rain. Or if it was particularly dangerous, we went out, we rowed in the rain. It didn't matter. But at the same time, yeah, the workouts in rowing are, they're brutal. I mean, they're a gut check, and they have to be. And so a lot of the training in the Marine Corps, the vast.
Oh, you put yourself on mute there, Rob.
Sorry, I got a call. But in the Marine Corps, the vast majority of the time, the training's tough, but it's not tough in the way that you are going out and you're doing 10 250-meter sprints back to back. It's a little bit different. So yeah, I'd say easier in some ways, more difficult in other ways. But the Marine Corps training, the attitude that came with it, that you train regardless of the circumstances, played heavily into my attitude as an athlete.
Yeah. And what was the distance race that you were competing in, and what kind of times would you have been getting?
The Paralympics trunk and arms mixed double sculls was 1,000 meters at the time. Now it's 2,000. They've increased it. But to be in the mix, you had to be doing that in 4 minutes, roughly 4 minutes or less. Like the team that won gold, China, did it in 3:54, and then second place was maybe 4 minutes flat, and then we were like a 4:01. So that's kind of where we were at.
Is that just a 4 minute sprint, 100%?
It's not a sprint. It's not a sprint in the same way that 100 meters is a sprint. But it is certainly, you're revving in the red the entire time. It's paced slightly because you can't just go all out for 4 minutes.
Yeah.
But it's designed, or you pace yourself such that by your last stroke you're dead.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I can imagine. So you ended up getting a bronze medal. Was that like beyond your wildest dreams, or were you going like almost expecting a gold, or what was the expectations going in?
We went in expecting and wanting to get a gold medal. So getting a bronze medal was incredible, obviously, because we went from basically nothing to third best in the world against crews that had been to Paralympics before and were kind of all expecting to do well and beat us as an unknown crew and a relatively inexperienced crew. So we went from that to bronze in 9 months. So we were very, very happy and very satisfied and very proud. Yeah. But at the same time, when you don't win, there's a little bit of you that goes, you're just slightly unsatisfied.
Yeah. Were you tempted to go for Rio 2016, or did you try to qualify?
No, I didn't go as far as Rio. I did one more season, but over the course of the 2013 rowing season, I just kind of recognized that rowing wasn't supplying the pieces that I had been looking for, the courage, brotherhood, and selflessness that, I had been seeking since 2006 when I joined the Marine Corps. And so, rowing, it certainly helped me regain my self-confidence and self-reliance and show me what I could do. But I knew it wasn't going to be the thing that brought me back to those pieces. And so it just didn't feel fully satisfying to me. And so during the 2013 rowing season, that's when I started thinking, well, what else can I do? And that's when I came up with the idea, or decided to do the cross-country bike ride.
Yeah, so about that cross-country bike ride, was that tying back into what you said previously about maybe setting an example for veterans coming back from war, that this is what can be achieved? Was that the complete inspiration behind that, just to get it out in the media, that this is what can happen to wounded veterans?
I hadn't gotten to that point quite yet. I certainly recognized that I could be an example for other people, but I think that the underlying driving force of the bike ride was still to push myself and to see what I was capable of doing. But at the same time, I wanted to kind of use it to do good. And so the good that I decided to do with it was raising money for veteran charities. But the driving force behind it wasn't quite that selflessness or that selfless reason. It was still kind of about proving to myself what I could do. Yeah. And so, that's sort of why at the end of the bike ride, I still wasn't totally satisfied either, because I hadn't quite mastered the selflessness part of the three, the big three that I had been seeking with the bike ride.
Okay. And just logistically, how did that work? Because it was 6 months, I think it took. So it's 5,200 miles. Have you got like somebody driving behind you in a camper van, or are you staying in hotels, or what way did it work?
So I had purchased do you guys have U-Haul over there in Ireland, like moving truck?
No, but I get an idea of what they are. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like instead of a pickup truck, it's a truck that has a big plywood box on the back that you fill with your stuff. It's called the U-Haul. You rent them from this place called U-Haul, and it was like the box part of it was 17 feet long and probably about 8 feet high. So there's this big box on the back, and I bought one of those that had 250,000 miles on it. I bought it for about $2,000. And what we did was I got my little brother on board. He was 17 when we started, turned 18 on the road. And he said that he would drive it behind me as my support vehicle. And so we kind of made it slightly comfortable. We put some carpets down. We got some cots that we put in the back with some sleeping bags, and we just filled it with food and water. And that was my support vehicle. And so we drove it up to Bar Harbor, Maine, in the northeastern part of the country, and started there. And basically what I did was just ride 30 to 35 miles every day. And at the end of the day, I would kind of try and stop at a place where I could remember, like I stopped at this church on this road. And so I would stop there, make note of where I stopped, and then we would load my bike into the back of the RV and then go find a place where I could park it, or we could park it and spend the night. So we'd spend a lot of the nights in a church parking lot, or in a volunteer fire department parking lot, or in vacant lots, or just anywhere we could find to park this RV. And we would sleep and eat some dried food, freeze-dried food, and then wake up the next morning, get out of bed, and find that spot that I had stopped the day before, and continue from that spot. Now, luckily, we ended up, as the ride progressed, my volunteer team got really good at calling ahead of where I was going to be and finding hotels and telling them the story, like, hey, he's coming through. Would you mind putting him up for a night? And I'd say 95% of the time we would have a hotel that we would go to. And a lot of that time too, somebody would end up buying us dinner. So we didn't have to sleep in the U-Haul quite as much as I was expecting to. And yeah, I just kind of followed that pattern diagonally across the United States for 181 days until we reached the end.
How tough physically was that? Like, did it nearly break you at any stage, or was it actually quite a nice cycle?
I wouldn't say that I got close to quitting or anything. I wanted to be, probably by the end of the first month, I wanted to be finished. Like I was like, okay, this isn't really fun anymore. This is kind of, work at this point. And I wanted it to be done, but I only wanted it to be done in the way that I had wanted it to be completed. So I never considered stopping and just calling it quits and being like, well, okay, I made it across the country. That's good enough. I wanted to do it diagonally.
Yeah.
And so, I never got to a point but there were certainly days where I wanted to be done more than other days, like when I was riding up giant mountains in a headwind or something, or if it was, minus 5 degrees, 5 degrees below zero, or whatever the case may be, and it was snowing and that kind of thing. Yeah. There were certainly days where I wanted to be done a lot more, but then there are also days where I loved it, like riding through South Utah, going down off these big mountains, and having this kind of break in the weather where it was 70 degrees and temperatures, and a fantastic view of the desert. So there was certainly days like that as well, but there was probably more days where it was tough than not.
Yeah. So you're saying that didn't really satisfy the selflessness that you were looking for. So you go and you do this month of marathons, which is 31 marathons in 31 days. So can you just talk us through the mentality behind approaching that? So where did that idea even come from?
Yeah, so the reason that the month of marathons was a little bit different and satisfied me was because the driving force behind it was was selfless, because I wanted to create this story that I told you about veterans, get it out there. That was the purpose of it.
Yeah.
And then because I had that purpose, so I got all the other stuff. I pushed myself physically and mentally, and I learned all the same lessons that I would have learned on the bike ride. But the reason that I did it was because it was to create the story as opposed to learn those lessons.
Yeah.
And so I figured that out after a couple of years. I did try and make the Paralympics in 2016, but in triathlon I failed. And so during the course of that training, I ran the Marine Corps Marathon for fun as a way to break up my training. And when I finally called it quits on trying to make the Paralympics, I started thinking of, well, what could be next? I remember that I ran the Marine Corps Marathon. I had learned about people that did similar stuff, like 50 Ironmans in 50 days in 50 states, or 50 marathons, 50 days in different 50 states or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, maybe I could put my own little spin on that. So I thought of a month of marathons, and the longest month is obviously 31. So 31 days, 31 marathons, 31 different cities, in order to get as many eyeballs on it as possible.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how I came up with the idea, and then kind of talked about it with my girlfriend Pam, who's my wife now, and she thought it was a good idea, but was worried that it was going to really do a lot of damage to my body, which I was worried about as well.
Yeah.
But we both decided that it was kind of worth it.
Yeah. So again, logistically, how did that one work? Because I think, didn't you start in London? So were you just kind of going to cities, then running a marathon, and then just catching a flight elsewhere? Or logistically, what way did it work?
So the only time we flew was London to Philadelphia.
Okay.
Obviously. But the rest of them were, I rented a 38-foot Class A RV, which is basically just a 38-foot rectangle on wheels. And so I had Pam, my wife, she just basically just ran the show. She was in charge of everything. All I was in charge of was running and doing interviews. So she kind of ran the show. And then my mom came along as kind of her assistant / my massage therapist. And then I had a friend named Colin that drove, that was kind of the primary driver. And then Pam kind of subbed in for the long drives as well. And so basically the way it would work was I would start running at 7 o'clock. And I would do, it was always personal marathon. So I would just run 26.2 miles either on a trail. So a running trail. I would run back and forth on the same 2.5 kilometers until I reached 26 miles. So I'd always cross in front of the RV every 5 kilometers in case I needed water or food, or if I needed to go to the bathroom or something like that. I would always be kind of close to the RV. Or I would run loops of a park or something like that. Like in Central Park, I ran loops of this one section of the park. And then I would break it down into, the first chunk would be 12 kilometers, and I would take a 20-minute break, and then 12, and then 20 minutes, and then 9.2 kilometers, 20 minutes, 9.2 kilometers, and I'd be done. And I would eat along the way and drink water as I needed, do interviews as news media organizations showed up. And people would run with me for different sections of it or the whole thing or whatever. And then at the end, I would kind of hang out for a little bit, but I would pretty quickly get into the RV and we would drive to the next city and find a place to park the RV, which was its own logistical challenge, getting permission to in different places to park. And then a lot of the times, the place that we parked would be the same exact place that I was running the next day. So, for example, in New York, we parked in front of a fire station in Manhattan. Okay. That had allowed us. And then I just got out of the RV and I ran to Central Park from there. But other times, I would park. We had to find a place to park, and then we'd have to go from there to the place where I was running. So, like in Salt Lake City, we parked at a friend's house because you aren't allowed to go in the park overnight. And so we parked at this friend's house, and then the next morning at 6:30 drove over to the place where I was going to be running. And so, then we park up, and I would usually eat and get a couple massages during the drive. And the next morning we would just do the same exact thing and kind of just repeat that for 31 times until we got to DC on November 11th.
Me personally, I've only ever ran one marathon in my life, and it was absolutely horrific. I probably thought about quitting about 400 times. Like, at any stage throughout these 31 marathons, did you ever think of just jacking it in, or was it, again, is it just that marine mentality, that adapt and overcome, where it was just something you were going to finish? And what was the most difficult part for you?
Again, yeah, it was kind of similar to the bike ride. Well, yeah, I was ready to be done, but I'd never considered really quitting. I never seriously considered quitting. The most difficult part, I would say, was probably the last 4 days, because I injured my back on slipping on a wooden bridge in the city of Nashville. But after that, I still had 4 more marathons to run, so 104 more miles. And I was thinking about the damage that I could do to my body, running with this injured back. And the pain was kind of excruciating as I landed every time I landed on my right foot, it kind of sent a shock of pain up my back. But during that time, I fell back on the purpose that I was doing it was I was creating this story on behalf of my fellow veterans and my fellow Marines that I knew would really help them and help the perception of veterans and give them a story, give everybody a story that they could use when they may be doubting themselves. And so that's why the selfless purpose behind it was what kept me going. Yeah. And it's why, it was so much more satisfying. And so that I fell back on that reason and I just kind of, made the decision to take the risk and endure the pain.
Yeah.
And I did in, the next 4 marathons were Atlanta, Charlotte, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C.
What was the final, say, 100 meters in Washington, D.C.? Like, can you remember the finish line?
Oh, yeah, I remember it. It was exhilarating. I kind of paused before my last mile. I stopped to make sure anybody that wanted to kind of finish along with me could come and join me for the last mile. And I did the last mile around the reflecting pool in Washington, D.C. and the National Mall. I ran the whole thing around the war memorials in the National Mall that we have here. And I promised everybody's going to run slow, but I ended up I ran a pretty fast mile because I was so excited. But it was just, me and then all these people from my past, like my fellow people that I deployed with. Pam was running right next to me. I had family members in the crowd, friends, and people that like nurses were there that had taken care of me, physical therapists that had taken care of me were there. So there's all these people from my past, like seeing me finish this really tough challenge. And at like the last 100 meters, I think was lined with people that have been watching. That probably 200-300 people that were all like cheering, and they set up a little finish line for me, and I crossed it. And I gave Pam a big hug and just kind of hugged all the people that were there, and kind of gave my victory speech in a way, just kind of talking about this. What I've been trying to show was that just because a veteran comes back injured doesn't mean that they're broken. Yeah. And so kind of gave my victory speech, and then just kind of visited with everybody and finally took a little break. A well-deserved break, I think. So these kind of brutal physical challenges you undertake, is this something you're going to continue? Like, have you got plans for any more? I don't have any plans to do anything quite on that level because, Pam and I, we have a newborn son that's 9 months named Harry. So for the foreseeable future, I don't have any plans to do anything on that level. But I'm continuing to do things like I still run the Marine Corps Marathon just about every year, maybe every other year. I ran the Marine Corps 50K last year. And so just kind of continue to be a representative in these different arenas where going out and doing runs where people wouldn't expect a double above knee amputee to be doing this run. And telling my story in podcasts and going out and do speaking engagements and things like that, just to continue to make sure that the story continues to get told. Yeah. And so that's kind of what I'm working on now. And I might come up with ideas to do something on a smaller scale, but bigger than just going out and running one marathon or something like that. Yeah. Like a 24-hour challenge or something like that, maybe. But just my objective now is to continue to tell that story and make sure it gets heard and seen by as many people as possible. Yeah.
Well, if you do kind of take up another physical challenge and you're looking to raise money, where could people follow you then to kind of find out where they could donate?
Yeah, sure. My website. I mean, you can still donate to the previous thing. I still have the donate page up, but it's robjonesjourney.com is my website, and then all my social media is at robjonesjourney. So you can, follow along there.
Cool. Look, there's 2 questions I ask everyone just to finish off the podcast. So the first one is, what athlete in the history of sport do you admire most from a mindset and mentality point of view, and why? And you can say yourself, to be fair, if you want.
No way. It's hard to say. I mean, growing up, My hero was Cal Ripken Jr., who was a baseball player. And it's interesting because he was known as the Iron Man of baseball because he set the record for most consecutive games played, like without taking a day off. It was like 2,632 games, like a 19-year career. He never took a day, never missed a game. And so I really admired him growing up, and I still do. And I've had the opportunity to meet him. Then there was, I wouldn't necessarily say that the Marines that I read about were athletes, so to speak, but they were certainly mentors to me in what they, giving me a model to follow as a Marine and something to strive towards as a Marine. Then I would say my rowing coach, Brad Lewis, was another big influence in that he wrote a book called Assault on Lake Casitas about his gold medal in the 1984 Olympics in rowing. And he kind of showed me what it took to be an Olympic athlete, the dedication, and people say obsession, but I prefer to say dedication that it takes day in and day out, and how meticulous you have to get with every aspect of your life has to be driven towards that one objective. So I would say, there's a lot of them, but I would say those are good enough for now.
Yeah, very good. And the last question then is, if you were to talk to a young athlete starting off, it can be in any sport, just a young guy starting off their career, what piece of advice would you give a young athlete, again, from a mental point of view?
I would say the two things that have made me, that I've learned in order to accomplish anything and overcome sort of any mental challenge, are figuring out a way to put to use the obstacles that get into your way. And so let's say as a rowing athlete, you're doing a training session where there's a headwind. Every rower hates having to row into a headwind because it's so frustrating. It just makes everything so much more difficult. But that headwind is giving you an opportunity to, do your session with a little bit more resistance or a little bit more of a challenge, so that you're using that challenge in order to become stronger than you would have if you would rode it without that headwind. So it's using, I call it use the weight. So like you're using that weight, that like a barbell, you're using it to become stronger by strict pressing it over your head instead of just sitting there holding it. So you're using that difficulty or that stress to make yourself stronger. So instead of thinking about something going wrong as this thing that went wrong, thinking of it as an opportunity to find a way where it can make you stronger if you have the right attitude about an approach to it. And then the second is the selfless purpose behind what you're doing. So in order to kind of withstand all the strain of day in, day out training in rowing, one of the things that kind of gave me the strength to be able to do that was realizing and knowing that my rowing partner, it had been her dream to go to the Paralympics since she was 13 or 14 years old. And by the time that we were rowing together, I think she was about 20, maybe 21. And so when I knew that her dream, I cared about her because she's my rowing partner, and she's like a sister, in a way. And so I knew that her dream relied on me being in the best shape and taking care of myself as much as I possibly could and being as disciplined as possible. Her dream relied on me being able to do that and being in the best shape as possible on race day in the Paralympics. And so when when I had to think about, well, maybe should I eat this piece of cake, or should I have an apple or a banana or something, or should I go to this social engagement, or should I get sleep, or should I quit or should I pull back a little bit in this training session because it really, really hurts and I'm breathing really hard, or should I push on, and even though it's going to hurt a lot, that made the choice clear was her dream relies on me to not quit in the training session, to push away the cake or to get the sleep. And so it's all about finding that person or that place or that thing that is relying on you to do the difficult thing or withstand the stress and the difficulty that you don't want to have to. So figuring out what that thing is and harnessing that power, that power of selflessness.
It sounds a bit like that selflessness that you're talking about. It sounds like that maybe even stems from just your time in the Marines. Would that be correct?
I'd say that's probably where I learned it the most. Yeah, and then because that's walking through a minefield or charging through machine gun fire. That is inherently selfless, and you're doing it for your fellow Marines, these people that you care about more than yourselves. Like when you get into the Marine Corps, you automatically drop down 2 or 3 notches in the ranking of importance.
Yeah.
So it's like your fellow Marines, the Marine Corps, your country, your fellow Marines, the Marine Corps, then you. And so you learn, and the only reason that you can charge through machine gun fire, do whatever, all these difficult things, is because you care about them more than yourself, because you're willing to risk your life for their life. And so it is that kind of same attitude where you're willing to endure these things that you don't want to have to endure because this person or this thing is relying on you to endure it, and you care about them more than you do yourself.
That's brilliant, Rob. Thanks a million for coming on. I mean, your story is incredible. You're probably the most inspirational fella I think I've ever spoken to. So thanks very much for coming on to the podcast.
I appreciate it, man. Thanks for the opportunity.
No worries. Big thanks this week to Rob Jones for coming on to the podcast. I think Rob is probably one of the most inspirational people I've ever spoken to in my whole life. I mean, some of the stories he was telling there, I can't even imagine going through them. But just hearing the way he's went through them and the way he's dealt with them mentally, it's just unbelievable. So massive thanks, Rob, for coming on to the podcast. And if anyone wants to follow Rob's journey as well, if you just go on to Instagram or Twitter or any of those social media pages and type in Rob Jones Journey, you'll find out all about him there, all about the challenges he takes on, and also there's information there if you want to find out about donating to it, which is well worth donating to as well, because as you heard throughout the podcast there, he donates to some really good causes. So yeah, again, big thanks, Rob, and thanks everyone for watching. I'll see you next week. Thanks.